Well, hello and welcome to EDUC 749 and week 6. I hope you've had a good week and a good weekend. I know at my school we finished the school year this week, and I'm assuming many of you have either finished or are getting close to finishing your school year, and hope that is wrapping up well for you. So we're going to jump into week 6 and get started. Before we get into new content in week 6, I did want to take a couple of minutes and go through primarily some things that were shared in week 4, because many of the things going back to week 4 and the discussion, or the assignment for week 4, which was the case study, 2 of those case studies involved behavior. And so I included this since we also in the past couple of weeks have talked about twice exceptional students. I don't think they mean being gifted at disruptive behavior. However, 2 of those case studies that you looked at did involve behavior, and 3 of you did kind of highlight some key factors that I wanted to build on. So Christine mentioned when she was reviewing the case study, that one of the things that she took away from that was the need for structured social emotional programs and school-wide instruction. That kind of getting to, it's more than just talking about respect, but that we have to have structured programs in schools. PBIS, or school-wide instruction, is a great example of that. Then Lindsay also talked about in her case study, which was the one on Anthony, talking about getting him to keep track of his behavior, which is a great strategy, self-monitoring behavior, and also reinforcing that many times what we default to is reminding kids, hey, Anthony, don't push. That's not necessarily effective, as opposed to thinking proactively about behavior. And self-monitoring is a great thing that we can be including in behavior plans to try to get students to track their own behaviors. There's lots of research behind that's a good strategy. Lindsay also talked about really getting into the history of Anthony's school and home life. And so one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about today are functional behavior assessments, which does part of that. It really gets into that background as to why a student might be engaging in that behavior. And then Stephanie very similarly talked about negative behaviors that can be at the center of their struggles. A behavior plan could be a highly productive way to encourage positive interactions. So again, so many times when we approach behavior, we're approaching our response to the negative behavior as in terms of reminding, hey, Anthony, don't push, as opposed to looking at a behavior plan that is proactive in teaching positive behavior. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. What I wanted to show you, and I will include this in Canvas, one of the things, I'm going to jump a few slides ahead here, one of the things that, based on the feedback that you have sent to me, your number one priority of things that you wanted to learn about in the next couple of weeks was IEPs and IEP goals. So I think we'll spend some time on that week 8. Your second priority was inclusive practices, or UDL, and we will do some specific things next week in week 7 about co-teaching and inclusive practices, and we'll try to bring some UDL back into that as well. The third priority that you shared as a class was autism or behavior management. I lumped that together. And so what I wanted to spend some time today, because that behavior management piece coincided really well with what you did in week 4, was to look at functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. So what I have, and I'll put this in Canvas for you, is a school district's template. And this is not the school district where I work, but it is a school district in Indiana, their template for functional behavior assessments. And so I'm not saying that in those 2 case studies that you reviewed that a functional behavior assessment was necessary. However, it could be if that behavior persisted. And so really what a functional behavior assessment is just a collection of data. So you can see here that you're going to gather information as a team. You're going to potentially look at parent interviews, teacher interviews, student interviews, a reinforcement survey, inventories, and you're also going to spend some time talking about the strengths of the student. That's a key part of it. What's the student good at? What do they like doing? Because we can include that in a behavior plan. As you look at the related deficits, there are things here like precipitating factors. So for example, the case study that a few of you reviewed where the student had vision impairments, that could be a precipitating factor that was causing his behavior, or home issues that we may be aware of. Like perhaps his mother is sick or battling cancer, and those kinds of things that may contribute to behavior. Setting events are things that we know. Maybe Fridays are always bad because we hypothesize because the student doesn't want to go home for the weekend. So what are some things in the setting that we think could be contributing to the behavior? Or, for example, we know math is hard and behavior is more prevalent in math class when we look at the data. Antecedents, many of you have probably seen ABC charts, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Antecedents are key when we're looking at behavior. What happened right before that behavior started? Because then we can track that behavior and try to change it. What are the things that are maintaining the behavior? Are there consequences that the student is getting from the behavior? And sometimes it is attention. It's negative attention. In many cases, any attention is better than no attention. So that will maintain the behavior if students are getting attention and looking at things in that way. And then finally, what are some deficits? Are there deficits, things that we know we need to, skills we need to teach a student because of their behavior concerns? Those are all things that are important even before we collect the data. So here on the functional behavior assessment, you can see we've got different behavioral data, anecdotal data, discipline data that can all be a part of that assessment to help us make decisions about a student's behavior. Then finally, a key part of a functional behavior assessment is a hypothesis. When the expectation is blank, the student is likely to do what behavior because of a deficit in what skill. And so those are some key components to functional behavior assessments. Once that's completed, then we can transition over to a behavior intervention plan. And the plan is really saying, okay, here's what we're going to do for this student based on all that data that we collected and what we learned about it. So what is the target behavior? What do we think is the function of the behavior? Is it attention seeking? Is it to avoid difficult tasks? Those kinds of things. Is it a social skills, attention seeking behavior that we think is the function? What are some proactive strategies? This is what several of you got to in your week 4 assignment, was not just responding to the negative behaviors, but how are we teaching replacement behaviors to the student? What are some proactive things that we're teaching him? Instructional strategies, how are we going to do that? Antecedent strategies, what things do we need to change in the environment to support their learning? Going back to antecedent, what happened right before the behavior? So if we can identify that, how can we change that? How can we change what happened right before? Positive consequences, of course, that's just typical reinforcement of positive behavior. Are there things that we need to take away? Negative consequence. That doesn't necessarily mean a punishment. That means, are there things that we can take away from the student to try to change that behavior? Could also include a crisis plan for some students. Behavioral goals, which are important as we kind of look at what we want the student to do instead of the negative behavior, and then what are resources that are out there. So I'll post this in Canvas so that you can spend some more time looking at it, but I know several of you were really interested in behavior, and I thought just kind of looking that over might be helpful to you. So as we look ahead to week 6, you're going to spend some time getting more informed on disproportionality. And really, disproportionality is looking at specifically disproportionate representation of different races or ethnicities in special education. So for instance, are certain racial or ethnic groups at a greater risk of being identified for special education? And, or are they at greater risk of being identified for specific disabilities? So for example, in my school district in Avon, a few years ago, we were found that we were disproportionate and that we had too many students that were identified as autistic that were white. So we had too many white students on the autism spectrum. And so we had to, in our special education department, change our processes to make sure we had things in place to eliminate that problem. At the same time, we were also found to be disproportionate and that we had too many African American students being suspended and expelled. And so as a result of that, we had to take funds that typically would have been spent for special education, and we had to divert those funds to fix that problem. And so for us, a lot of that became PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. That was how we sought to address the issue of suspensions and expulsions, was by supporting all students and all of our teachers and buildings with more positive behavior support. So this past year we were released from that. So our data, it worked. Our data trended in the right direction. There's also some information this week on low incidence disabilities. So those are the disabilities that you may or may not have a student in your class each year that has these kinds of disabilities. Most of us will have students with learning disabilities or students with autism. These are disabilities that you're going to study that it may be every few years that you have a student with those disabilities, but it's still important that we learn about them. So there are 3 videos this week that focus on disproportionality. One is Dr. Russ Skiba from Indiana University. He's kind of one of the big experts in the country in disproportionality. He'll talk about that and minority representation in special education. And then there's another video talking about RTI and disproportionality. And finally, a video that focuses on technology supports for students with low incidence disabilities. So I really like these videos. I hope that you'll find them beneficial as well. 2 formal assignments and then one additional one that I've added. There's a discussion post on disproportionality. There's also an assignment this week looking at exceptionality and cultural situation scenarios that you'll spend some time on. As a part of that discussion post on disproportionality, I'd like you to send me an email or a message with one aha that you learned about disproportionality this week, and how you could use that aha in your classroom. And I really mean this can be 2 sentences. This does not need to be fancy. It doesn't need to have citations. Quick and dirty is fine. The reason I'm doing this is because sometimes I think there are things that maybe you don't want to put in a discussion post, but disproportionality is an area that sometimes makes us think, I'd like to do something different, or I'd like to look at my classroom a little bit differently. I don't necessarily want to tell all my classmates this, but I'd like you to tell me that. So my example would be that, for instance, you might look at the data or the presentation this week and think, my aha was that schools are held accountable for how different races or ethnicities are disciplined in terms of suspension and expulsion. So I'd like to look at my discipline referrals for the year and make sure they're representative of the makeup of my class. So if 10% of my class is African American, my discipline referrals should reflect that as well. So if you could send me that, that'll count for 2 points of your discussion post this week. To send me that information as well by the end of the week is fine. Looking ahead, we've already talked about this. We'll address those additional areas. I'll try to do as much as I can in the time we have left. As we've talked about, some of these topics could be whole courses of their own, so it is really hard as we try to cover a lot of content at an introductory level in an 8-week course, but I will particularly try to address the top 2 IEP goals and inclusive practices in the next 2 weeks, and hopefully some of the, again, skimming the surface of behavior management that I shared with you today is helpful as well. And with that, that's all I've got. I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.